Well, good morning, everybody. It's almost afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. We're going to have an interactive couple of sessions here. I'm going to talk for just 15 minutes, and I'm going to go really fast. And you're going to hold your questions, because at the end of the 15 minutes, we're going to have a panel here, and we'll take lots of questions, okay? So the first question I have is, who can guess where I'm from? Anybody? Anyone? Go ahead, just yell it out. What is that? It's a place. It's Silicon Valley, all right? All right. So I run the Startup Accelerator for Citrix. Who just heard BB talk in the general session a minute ago? Yeah, that was really a good talk. I encourage you, if you didn't see it, go get the video and see him speak about the 4 pillars of doing a startup. Citrix acquired his company several years ago, and in working with the NetScaler group over the last few years, it's been really exciting for me. We actually delivered our Startup Accelerator program here in Bangalore just this week on Monday and Tuesday. So the Startup Accelerator from Citrix, I'm not going to talk a lot about it here. If you have questions, I'll answer them later. But we run a program in Silicon Valley and different places around the world, including right here in India. Go ahead. So who thinks Silicon Valley is a place? Hands up. Couple people think it's a place. Next slide. Next slide. Who thinks it's a state of mind? A few more people there. So you may have heard this before. You know, Silicon Valley, certainly there is a place called Silicon Valley, and something special happened there, but it can happen anywhere in the world. In fact, what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes about how do we do this on a global scale, not just at a local scale like Silicon Valley. So next slide. So I'm going to give you a very brief history of Silicon Valley. I'm going to go really fast. All of this information is up online. If you go to the next slide, this was actually a presentation given by Steve Blank. Steve Blank's a professor at Stanford and at UC Berkeley. And he's also known as kind of the father of the lean startup movement. So he's a pretty well-known guy, and you can get this on video or you can get the slides online. So it's a pretty long presentation, and I'm going to do the really fast 5-minute version of it. So most people think Silicon Valley was a bunch of citrus fields, and then it became Silicon Valley like overnight in the 1960s. And that's not exactly true. Next slide. Oh, it's taking its time here. What actually happened, if you go back in time, is Silicon Valley was created over a period of decades. So that's the first thing to understand, that Silicon Valley didn't happen very quickly. It took a lot of ingenuity, a lot of people, a lot of money going back to World War II. Any luck there? Yeah. So this goes back 50, 60 years. The first electronic war, some would argue we're in one right now on the internet with a lot of companies competing, but the first one was back in World War II. Next slide. So there was an air war going on between the US and Britain and Germany back in World War II. The British would bomb Germany by the day, the US by night. Go ahead. The problem was, if you looked at France and Germany at that time, they had deployed a wide array of radar. So they could pick up a lot of the bombers coming over. Next slide. And there was a high degree of casualties. There was about 80,000 casualties of both the British and the US. So that's 160,000 killed airmen. So that's a huge problem that needed to be solved to win World War II. Next slide. One of the ways to solve that was to create some electronics to jam the radars of the Germans. Next slide. And the guy who ran the secret lab and became the father of electronic warfare was a guy who originally was with the MIT labs, and during the war he started a secret lab at Stanford, and hence Stanford became a major research university. Frederick Terman became the father of Silicon Valley, the dean of engineering at Stanford, and the provost. He also encouraged some of his students to be some of the first major entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, like Hewlett and Packard. And so what happened over the course of just about 10 years, because of the war effort, we created this ecosystem of innovation. And if you look at it closely here, it was really the military and the US government that financed the first entrepreneurs up at the top. The motivation was the crisis, the World War II that we were experiencing, but really most importantly, the culture was created. And you hear about Silicon Valley culture, and the magic comes out of the culture. There's a spirit of cooperation, of entrepreneurship, and a general openness to share ideas. So this concept of open innovation was born way back then. Go ahead. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Bay Area, there was a radar bombing training for the Air Force, and the guy who ran that started a company. Go ahead. William Shockley. So he is known as the co-investor of the transistor, hence silicon. Transistors were implemented in silicon, and he founded Shockley Semiconductor in 1955. And out of that blossomed what we know today as Silicon Valley, even though we really don't do silicon there anymore, right? We do designs there, but it's not manufactured there. So that's part of the story here is it started with electronics, then it was silicon, and then it's moved on through the decades to new things. So reinventing all the time is really a key to that. And how does that happen? Go ahead. It happens because people work in one company, maybe a large company, and then they go on and do startups. Now, you can't see what it says on here, but this is a map of all the semiconductor companies that blossomed out of Fairchild in the 50s and 60s. And right about here, this is 1968. That's where Intel was born. That was my first employer there. So you can see there was just a mushrooming of companies that came out of one company. And that's what we're seeing here today, right? These ecosystems, like what we have here in India, in Bangalore, you're seeing successful companies like Netscaler bought by Citrix, and then the entrepreneurs come out of there, and they take their capital, as BV just said, is when you're successful, don't just be done, give back. And that's what happened here in Silicon Valley. Go ahead. So the first major IPOs happened in the late 50s, like Hewlett-Packard, so all of a sudden the money part started to roll. We had major exits. Go ahead. So with Hewlett-Packard being born in the late 50s, we had the genesis of what really became Silicon Valley, where we had integrated circuits and then personal computers, then internet, then software, and it goes on and on and on and recreating itself. The other major part that you'd all be aware of today, but back then people didn't really think about it as venture capital, there was just risk capital. And the original people who took the risk were individuals, just like we have angels today. A lot of these guys came from the East Coast of the United States, where high risk wasn't what they wanted to do. If you went to the financial capital, like New York at the time, people wouldn't have wanted to do this. It took moving out to the West Coast for people to think about taking high risk. So our first angels, if you want to call them that, started some of the first investments that look relatively small in today's coinage, but this was a semiconductor. It took a lot more capital, but in today's dollars, that'd be much higher. Next slide. And this gave the rise to risk or venture capital. And the first big venture firms were born back there in the 1960s and 70s and helped with government programs as well, which is a key emphasis I want to make. Government has always had a hand in this. Today, a lot of people think Silicon Valley is all private money. In the early days, it was not. There was a lot of government policies that helped infuse that. And that gave rise to the ecosystem, if you go to the next slide, where we now replaced what was happening with the war as a motivation, as profit as a motivation. We had venture capital come in a big way over the years, and yet we had that underlying culture that made it all work. So that is how Silicon Valley became Silicon Valley. So again, if you want to go into more depth here, you can see the presentation online from Steve Blank, read his blog. Steve's a great source of startup wisdom, so I'd encourage you to do that. So that's my quick history lesson of Silicon Valley. Now I want to go on and talk a little bit about what's happening now. And how can we take that magic that's been created in different parts of the world, and it's being created here, and make it work together to help you make you successful. Next slide. So Silicon Valley now really is a state of mind, okay? It's really about taking that culture that we created in the West Coast in the US and bringing it into different ecosystems around the world. It's the free flow of people and ideas, okay? One of the things we talk a lot about as investors is ideas are free, okay? Nobody has a great new idea. Every idea you have, somebody else has already thought of. It's about putting a team together around that idea and making something happen with that. It's about execution of ideas that matters. And it sure helps if you have a pool of people available that can help you both technically and with business and with capital. So you really want to have that pool of people that can help who preferably have done it before. So people who've been operators who now perhaps are in venture capital firms or running programs like mine that are doing accelerators that have operational experience can help the young entrepreneurs. The culture of risk, you've heard the term, I bet, fail fast, don't fear failure. This is really important. We really want to encourage teams to come together around ideas, make things happen, but don't take a long time to fail. Take a little time to fail, and we're going to help you do that. What we do in my accelerator is we actually help startups fail. Sounds funny, doesn't it? But to achieve success, you have to fail a lot. So we give our teams the tools and the mindset to fail quick so they can move on to the next thing. So reinvention is so important about the entire ecosystem and about individual companies. The other thing to look at as we look at the global innovation ecosystem today is we want to encourage diversity. So I want to use this metaphor of a jungle versus your cultivated field of, say, corn. So if I drive through the Midwest of the United States, I see row and row and row and row of corn. That's not what we want in the startup. We don't want you guys to all look the same and think the same. In fact, if you're going to have a great company, you have to think differently, right? You need to look at diverse sets of people to work with, diverse sets of people to sell to, and the more diversity, the more funny things happen, right? So that's what we want. You heard the term unicorns. Unicorns are referred to billion-dollar companies that pop out of nowhere, and nobody could have predicted. And that's what really happens in startup land. Through diversity, we get funny things happen, and many of these companies can grow to be very big companies, and nobody would have guessed it. So diversity matters, and I encourage you to diverse your teams and your customers. We launched our program this week, I mentioned, here in Bangalore. We'd had actually 16 different teams come in, and then we mixed them all together, so we ended up with 10 teams total, and we did 2 days of creation of new products. So each of the 6 teams created a new product in 2 days. The very first thing we did was we went out and interviewed potential customers. So this was a contrived business model, of course, but we literally walked out of the hotel down the block. We went into a mall, and we made mostly these technical people, these engineers, interview people on the street about what their experience was in the workforce. And we targeted millennials, as it was, to understand what their thinking was about the work environments they're in or they want to be. And then we asked the teams to come back. And over the course of Monday afternoon and Tuesday, they created a product, they tested it, they prototyped it, and they presented it. And we had a ton of fun. And we helped them get the concept of it's okay to fail fast, but guess what? They built products out of paper. So what if it fails? We did it at very low cost, we did it very fast, and if it didn't hit the mark, that's fine. So that's what we try to encourage the teams to do. Next slide. So we're doing these Citrix Startup Accelerator Innovator programs around the world now, because we are trying to create this global ecosystem where we're all talking to one another. One of the problems with the Silicon Valley, the place, is that we have a tendency to sit back there in Silicon Valley and wait for you to show up on our doorstep. And that's still going to happen. We know that. Like BV said a minute ago, it makes sense for a lot of companies to come to the US, particularly if your customers are there or you want to get capital from there. So I'm not saying it's not a good thing and it's a model we've long understood, but I think going forward, what we want to do is go out. And I want to meet you, and I want to understand what's happening in this market, because in the next 20 years, the world's going to look really different, right? It's not going to be about California alone. It's going to be about ecosystems all around the world. So we're launching our programs, and we're going to be building this global network of entrepreneurs, investors, and most importantly, customers. Now, we are involved mostly in B2C, or enterprise as our primary focus in our accelerator. So that's a critical thing, is how do we get to those enterprises to test these very young products out? And that's a bit of a trick, and I'll tell you about that right now. Next slide. The key thing to do is identify, very first, the red circle there, desirability. And again, BV just talked about that. He went into Sun Microsystems trying to sell a solution. Guess what? They didn't need it. So he had to go back and reconfigure a new product. Back in those days, in the early 2000s, he talked about taking a year to do that. Well, you can't do it in a year anymore. You have to do it in months or weeks. So you have to iterate much more quickly today than you did 10, 15 years ago as he did. And you have to do it with less money. Obviously, it's a lot less expensive to do a startup today than when he did it. But the key thing is you've got to find customers that say, I want that thing. And in fact, if you do a pilot with them and you say, I'm going to take that pilot away from you, you want them to say, no, don't take it away from me. If you hit that chord, you know you're onto something. If they just say, well, I may get around to it when you have more features or whatever, that's bad. You don't want that. So once you've established desirability through human-centered innovation, as we call it, understanding what the human's need is, then we go on to the bottom two circles around evidence-based entrepreneurship. You need to produce evidence, written evidence, that there's a business model that will sustain this desirable product, that you can make money on this thing. People will pay for this. And that's where you have to do today if you're going to get venture funding. Next slide. So really what I want to leave you with today is push yourselves, okay? Get out of your comfort zones. Get out of your comfort zones and your networks that you have today. They're fine, they're good, you're going to use those. But grow your networks out. Grow them geographically. Grow them through diversity. And in that way, you're going to really find things you would have never expected. Next slide. In fact, in our program, we make everybody in our 3-month program do 100 customer interviews. We used to leave this to them and hope they would do it, and I don't do that anymore. They have to do it. Because if you do this, if you push yourself to do 10 interviews a week, you're going to change your business model so quickly you'll be very surprised. You know, 1 in 100 business models, maybe 1 in 1,000, are perfect the day you write them. But I would wager that the vast majority are never right the first time you do it. So you've got to go out there and talk to a ton of people. And when I say customers, I mean that in the broadest sense. They could be potential partners, anybody in your value chain, and have them help you, give you the evidence of what you need to do to change your business model. Next slide. So last story here, and then we'll bring the panel up. When we ran our Innovators program in Santa Clara, we had a really good entrepreneur come into the program. And he had a really good idea, and he had a really good team, and he had $1 million in seed funding all lined up. So he was looking good, right? So we had him go do these 100 interviews. He was about 3-4 weeks in. He had done 30 interviews. Every week we make everybody come up and present to the other teams and tell us what's happened this week. What have you learned this week? Have you challenged your assumptions about your business? And he got up and his head was down and he said, and he kept walking around and saying, you know, I called my girlfriend this weekend and we talked for a long time because they don't live in the same city. And I've decided after doing 30 interviews and asking everybody would they buy my really cool product because they really love my products, that I got a response of 0 when they said would they write a check for this. So I'm gonna give it up. I'm just gonna kill the business right now. I'm going to give the $1 million back. He hadn't actually taken the check yet.